My name is Julia Recco, and I work for the American Farm Bureau Foundation for Agriculture as the Director of Education Outreach. I also work with managing Feeding Minds Press, our publishing company. And the goal of Feeding Minds Press, of course, is to publish accurate and engaging books about agriculture, which I hope you all are excited about to learn about more today. And I would also like now to introduce our very special guest who will be leading this webinar today, Emma Dryden. And so Emma founded Dryden Books, LLC, which is a premier children's editorial and publishing consultancy firm, after 25 years as a children's editor and publisher with several major publishing houses. She's edited over 1,000 books for children, consults on writing and illustration careers and publishing strategies, and teaches extensively about writing craft, as well as traditional and non-traditional publishing best practices. Emma is co-author of the award-winning picture book, What Does It Mean to Be an Entrepreneur?, and serves as an advisory board member to the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, which if you don't know about them, definitely look them up after this webinar. And so with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Emma, who's gonna lead us through learning more about picture books. Emma.
Hey, thank you, Julia. It's delightful to be here, and I echo Julia's statement. Thank you all for being here. This is a strange time for all of us, and we have our ups and downs, good days and bad days, good hours and bad hours. I know that personally, and I know with all of you. So hopefully this will be a good hour for all of us. I'm delighted you're here. And some of you, I'm going to keep this kind of 101, sort of a basic overview of really what a picture book is, what the best considerations are when you're writing a picture book. Perhaps some of you are illustrators as well, and this will be pertinent as well. And for some of you, this is going to be new information. Some of you, this is going to be a good refresher. Either way, hopefully you'll get some good takeaways out of this. And as Julia said, this will be recorded, so you'll have access to this later on, because we're going to go pretty quickly. There's a lot to cover. So welcome everybody to Picture Books 101. So I want to just start off with some kind of bullet points to reiterate what a picture book really is. So picture books are illustrated stories. These can be fiction or nonfiction or concept books for children generally between the ages of 3 to 6 or 4 to 8. Those are not just random age ranges. These are age ranges, 3 to 6 or 4 to 8, that have been established over many, many decades of picture book publishing. These are the age ranges established by publishers that kind of correlate to how bookstores sell and place picture books. So we're talking about very young children, and that's something we're going to come back to quite a bit through this talk. Picture books are stories designed to be read aloud multiple times. And I mean read aloud hundreds of times. Any of you, and I know Julia, you have young kids at home, but a lot of you who read picture books with kids or have that opportunity, particularly bedtime, but even in the classroom, you know if a picture book works if a child asks for it over and over again. So that's something, again, that we will come back to, this notion of how do you make a story that's meant to be read aloud multiple times and heard over and over again. So picture books are stories with words and pictures designed on purpose to be experienced together. So a picture book doesn't exist if it's words only or illustration only. Now that's a generalization because there are some picture books that are wordless. Those do exist, some of them are magnificent. But for our purposes today, let's think about how words and pictures, or what are also called illustrations, are designed to be experienced together so that you get a full story for the child by hearing the words and looking at the pictures. That's the best way to get the full story. That is a picture book. The text in a picture book manuscript is 1,000 words or fewer. And you'll see I've put there in parentheses, 500 words to 800 words is the ideal. These, again, are not just random numbers picked out of the air. Picture books historically used to be a lot longer than this. And I'm talking back in the 40s and 50s and 60s when the picture book market sort of started to come into its own. There were such things as picture storybooks, which were quite a bit longer than 1,000 words. Where we are in the marketplace today, and this is really important, is that we have all learned as publishers, as editors, as agents, as writers, illustrators, shorter picture books are the most successful in terms of keeping a child's interest and keeping the adult's interest as well. Because again, if we think about how many times the adult is going to read that story aloud to a child, the fewer words, the better for the read aloud part of it. What's also sort of feeding into this notion of 500 to 800 words is the ideal, is that the fewer words on the page, the more room there is for illustration. And that's really important to experience the story, again, through the visuals as well as through the words. Typically, picture books run 32 pages, and we'll look at a typical picture book layout towards the end of this session, so you can get a sense of what a 32-page layout generally looks like. Some of you may already be using 32-page templates, but if not, you'll have one as part of this webinar to work with. So in a picture book, your text is going to focus on character, plot, and action. Simple action, simple plot, simple character with very little description. Again, now all stories focus on character, plot, and action. That could be even YA novels. But for a picture book, you need to think about your audience all the time. That audience of 3 to 6-year-olds, or perhaps 4 to 8-year-olds, they're young, their attention spans are not huge. So as you're thinking about character, plot, and action, you're thinking sort of simple enough, not dumb, but simple enough to kind of engage that young child where they are in the life experiences they have, in their sort of frame of reference. In nonfiction picture books, the text should focus on imparting information in an inspirational way. So these are not sort of hardcore informational books. Those are reserved for sort of older kids who need them for class curriculum supplements and that kind of thing. But in this young picture book, nonfiction, the information you're imparting needs to be fun and inspirational and simple. Again, the concepts need to be fairly simple. So in a picture book, the language that you use to write the picture book, whether this is prose or poetry, rhyming or not, it must be rhythmic, musical, interesting, and fun to listen to. Now, I do want to put a caveat here that rhyming is probably the hardest thing to write in picture books. It may come naturally to some of you, and it may not to others of you, but picture books that rhyme, you've heard from agents or editors that they don't like rhyming picture books, you know what? They will publish rhyming picture books, I promise you, but they have to be excellent. And to make a rhyming text excellent is one of the biggest challenges there is in picture books. And excellence depends upon, can, again, the story be read aloud over and over and over? Is it fluid? Is it rhythmic? There is there are many ways to create lyrical, rhythmic picture book texts that feel like poetry, but they don't necessarily rhyme, but they have a rhythm to them. They have kind of a cadence that makes it fun and interesting to hear, let alone to read. Illustrations are meant to add layers and meaning to a story. So very often what we'll see in a manuscript for a picture book, like an early draft of a manuscript, is that it's too full of description and detail, much of which can be left to the illustrator. So the pictures serve a very important role in expanding a story, in layering a story. And this sort of challenge for the picture book writer is to, over the course of revision and time, learn how to trust that a simple text will give the illustrator enough to actually illustrate it in a very rich way and bring a lot of story to the manuscript. The text and art work together, like I've said, in a picture book. There always needs to be room for the pictures to add to the story, but there also needs to be room for readers to bring emotional response to the story as well. So we're going to look at this a little bit later in more depth. But think about that. The reader, this young child, is a very important factor in how a picture book can be experienced. Your characters, whether they're human, animal, alien, vegetable, toy, whatever your characters are, they need to embody the worldview and sensibility of your young child reader. So again, thinking about children between the ages of 3 to 6, 4 to 8, what's their worldview? What are their sensibilities? How do they emote? How do they express their emotions? And if you can sort of tag into that, then that will help you create characters on the page that will resonate with those young readers. And finally, the themes in your picture books need to be pretty straightforward and concrete. Picture book readers are too young to think in highly abstract terms. They're too young to understand vagueness. So themes, plots, storylines need to be pretty concrete to serve this particular audience. So there are some key milestones, and this chart I have found very useful. I picked up this chart from a session I took quite a few years ago by child educators. And as you'll read through, you'll see what these sort of physical, cognitive, social, emotional, and play milestones generally are for ages 2 to 5 and ages 6 to 8. Now this chart also goes up into 9 to 11, which is your middle grade audience, and 12 to 14, which is your sort of older middle grade going into YA audience. Those are things we're not going to necessarily address here today because we're focusing on picture books. So you want to look at these charts for the 2 to 5s and the 6 to 8s and kind of notice the differences. So for the physicality, when you're between the ages of 2 and 5, you can throw a ball. You sort of learn how to throw a ball, you learn that concept, you learn that physical action. By the time you're a little bit older, 6 to 8, you don't only throw the ball, but you can roll it, bat it, kick it, etc. So your physicality has gotten more complex. Same with cognitive milestones. You know, when you're very young, little ones can sort of create a story element, like a child getting lost, or a bear missing its blanket, or something of that nature, a bird afraid to fly. Those are sort of simple story elements that a very young child can actually comprehend. But it's an element. As they get a little bit older, they can create larger stories around those elements, or they can start adding elements together to create larger stories. In this cognitive milestone 2 to 5, little ones are easily frustrated and easily impatient. If you have little ones at home, particularly in this time of stay at home and quarantine, I'm sure that a lot of you are experiencing how easily they can get frustrated and impatient. So can we. As they get a little bit older, they learn patience. Why this is important when you're thinking about creating picture books for little ones is that, again, you want to keep your stories fairly streamlined, fairly simple, not too complex, not too vague, for this reason that kids will get impatient and frustrated. And what little kids do, and I've seen this in story hours, and maybe you have too, they will get up and leave the room if they're bored, or if they're not interested in the story being told, or if they don't care about the character or the story, or if they don't understand it. In this terms of social emotional milestones, when they're very young, they are starting to develop a very simple sense of self. They're starting to learn their names. They're starting to understand sort of who they are, who their parents are, who maybe they have friends, family, very simple things about who they are in the world. And they're learning gender roles. As they get a little bit older, they're starting to develop individual identities. And they're associating, again, at this young age, mostly with their own gender. Keep in mind, all of these are very general, but they're kind of good guidelines to help you understand who is my audience of 3 to 6 year olds. Who perhaps is my audience of 4 to 8 year olds? What are they? Where are they on the sort of in the social emotional sphere? And in terms of playing, at this bottom line here, when they're very young, parallel play is often playing by themselves, or learning how to sort of become more dexterous, how to sort of hold something in their hand, how to put a puzzle piece into the right holder, you know, how to roll a ball or throw a ball rather. As they get a little bit older, collaborative play becomes who's their first best friend. They go to the playground, they're in preschool perhaps, and they become more socialized to start to play with others. So this is just a good milestone. Like I say, I have used this chart myself when I think about our readers for picture books. So as we think about picture book structures, there are kind of 3 large structures that I wanted to break down for you a little bit. The first is called problem and solution. Character has a problem. There is a solution to that problem. There is the symmetrical paradigm, which is a structure that I will show you in a moment, where there's kind of a beginning, a middle, and end that I'm making this gesture. It kind of comes full circle. So there's some symmetry in the story from beginning to end. And then there's the concept structure and or the nonfiction structure. So I'm going to break these down for you just with some examples. So let's look at problem and solution. And I've put at the top of this slide a kind of statement for you to think about and use as an exercise when you're thinking about your story. And it's interesting that as I was thinking about this statement, and I'll read it to you, hero wants a goal, but they can't because of an obstacle or problem. So they take an action and they learn a theme. You can apply this statement to every book you write. YA, middle grade, picture book, nonfiction, even concept is not quite the same. But if you have a story with a character, they need to have a goal. There needs to be some challenge to that goal, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Action needs to be taken to achieve that goal or to achieve a different goal and to learn something at the end. Why there needs to be an obstacle or problem that prevents the hero from getting to their goal or getting their goal is because nothing moves a story forward like a problem, like conflict, like a challenge. That's what creates good story. If a hero gets what they want, so what? There's nothing that exciting about that trajectory. They want something, they get it, the end. If they can't get it though, there's where the story sort of starts to take place. So a character is often in a picture book introduced in terms of their problem or conflict that they're having. That conflict, and again, we're talking about picture books, we're talking about very young children, so these are not necessarily highly complex problems or conflicts, but maybe they can't get to sleep. They need to go to sleep, that's the goal. They can't or they won't, that's your obstacle or problem. So, and it goes from there. Maybe a favorite stuffed toy has gone missing. Maybe mom washed it in the washing machine and it's not the same again. That's a personal story, but never mind. So you introduce your character, introduce the problem pretty quickly. And then in this sort of problem and solution structure, the character needs to make several attempts to solve the problem, to reach their goal. And there's usually 3 attempts. And if any of you have heard of the sort of magic of 3, I don't know the sort of academic foundation for why the 3 sort of attempts is so gratifying and satisfying in story, but it is. It's been proven for hundreds of years, actually, in movies, in books, this sort of solving 3 issues before the final solution or the final sort of turn of events is a very kind of comfortable, thoughtful experience in a story, particularly for young children. They can handle that. And then there's a resolution. And the resolution, and here's the parentheses, is the most important part of this. If you can come up with a resolution to the problem in a way that the character didn't expect or in a way that the reader didn't expect, that's terrific, because that keeps the reader engaged. That's sort of the surprise at the end of the story. And it's often the wonderful surprise at the end of the picture book that makes kids want to hear it all over again. If there's a surprise at the end that gets the character to their goal in a way they didn't expect, little kids want to hear the story again to see if they can figure out the surprise before the surprise happens. So I've broken down for you here, just in terms of pages in a 32-page picture book, of how the layout might look in a problem and solution scenario. And again, we're going to look at a layout template at the end of this webinar. And again, you'll have this for reference. But see how this breaks out. So page 1 and or page 2 and 3 are often the title page, copyright page, etc. So your character is going to get introduced on page 3 or 4, 5. The problem gets introduced right away. The stakes start to get raised. This means, stakes are very important in any story. Stakes are the problem that the character has and the attempt they make to solve the problem. And you'll see here what happens if they don't get what they want, you know. So the stakes get raised, the attempts are made, the third and final attempt is made, the hint of resolution is coming, but perhaps in an unexpected way. As the book kind of comes down towards its close, you have your climax, success is hanging in the balance, and by pages 30, 31, 32, you have your resolution or your reversal or your final image. You'll see on this document, I've used the word spread. For those of you who don't know what a spread is, I'm just going to hold up a picture book here. So you have a page here and a page here. The two pages together are a spread. So you'll hear that term used a lot, and it's an important one for you to know, because editors and agents and designers, we talk about what's on the page or what's on the spread. So that's important to know. With each spread, and you'll see this in this document here, each spread is like a scene, and the page turn is like the cliffhanger that leads you to the next scene. So if you break down your text in this way to sort of look to see the shape of your story and see if it works in this problem and solution structure, understanding how the structure works in terms of pages and spreads can help you design how your plot is going to move through this kind of structure. So the symmetrical paradigm is a little bit of a different approach to the shape and structure of a story. And the kind of simplest way, I think, for this purpose of today's session is to put a picture book into a screenwriting structure. Some people don't like this structure. It's very kind of restrictive. Other people love it. Again, this is a structure that's often used with novels. It is a structure that's used in screenwriting. But essentially, instead of thinking about your story page by page, spread by spread, now you're thinking of it in percentage, really. So the first 20% of your story, basically, is Act 1. It's the beginning. It's the story setup. It's the character's problem, and the first kind of challenge to that problem. Then there's a plot twist, and that's the equivalent of the challenge that the character has to start meeting and figuring out. Act 2 is the story's middle. That's the story's primary action. That's about 60% of your story. It's in this middle that characters are going to sort of try to meet and achieve 3 different challenges. And again, I'm using 3 as a good example because that is, again, a very comfortable sort of structure. There's a midpoint, and this is probably between the second challenge and the third challenge, where the story splits from before and we're heading into after. There's a plot twist 2. We're heading into the home run here. We're headed towards the end of the book, where resolution has to start coming, or reversal. Act 3 is the last sort of 20% of the story, the last 5 to 7 pages. Again, this is a structure that can work extremely well with novels. I find it a little harder to think about a picture book and 20%, 60%, 20%, because we're only dealing with 32 pages. But if this is kind of a structure that appeals to you, then you can play with it. And, you know, again, remember that these are not hard and fast rules. These are tools for you to work with as you think about how is a picture book structured? How do they work? And something I recommend to all of you is look at some of your favorite picture books, or any picture books in a bookstore or library, and instead of just reading them for fun, read them in order to study them. Is it a problem and solution structure? And how so? Is it a symmetrical paradigm? Can you sort of take the picture book, and assess it in such a way to see, oh, that's Act 1. Oh, there's a plot twist. There's Act 2. There's a midpoint, plot twist 3. Oh yeah, there's an Act 3. Study picture books. I really recommend this to see if you can kind of apply some of these structures to them, because that's a great way to figure out how some of your favorite picture books actually work. Like, how did the author do that? This is often a great way to look at picture books and figure them out. So as we think about concept and or nonfiction books, structures vary greatly when it comes to what kind of concept book or nonfiction book it is. An alphabet book, obviously, the structure is the alphabet. This is the same with counting. The structure is either 0 to 10 or 10 down to 0 or both. And I include 0 because I'll never forget years ago, teachers started complaining to publishers that counting books started at 1 and really should start at 0. So I don't know if this is a controversial thing, but I throw it out there for you to think about as you're thinking about counting books or counting concept books. So this is a list that Julia and I came up with together because we're eager to see submissions for Feeding Minds Press specifically. And a lot of these concepts that we've listed here are exactly what Feeding Minds Press is looking for. There are, of course, other concepts, other nonfiction topics, but for these purposes, these are a lot of concepts for you to explore and think about. And again, they're very simple. First words, food groups, facing fears, holidays, a new friend, a new skill, going to school, often first day of school, or picture day at school, seasons, weird facts. These are all young concepts that are meant to be treated in a very young way as you're thinking about concept books, again, for 3 to 6-year-olds or 4 to 8-year-olds. You don't want to get too complex. Alphabets are an interesting concept insofar as over the course of my many years as a publisher, I have had submitted to me very, very sophisticated alphabet books. But the sort of struggle with a sophisticated alphabet book is that kids learn the alphabet when they're very young. So they're not necessarily as sophisticated as the sophisticated alphabet book would like them to be. Sometimes sophisticated alphabet books are really meant more for adults than for little children. So again, this is a reason to study concept books. Library, bookstore, read a lot of them. Look at the different alphabet books. Look at different bedtime books. Biography is an important nonfiction topic. When you're thinking about picture book biography, of which there are many now, the market is kind of thrilled with nonfiction picture book biographies. The idea here is not to give a whole life story. That's too much for a picture book. That's too much for a young child. The focus on biography really in the picture book realm is really to kind of find that thing that happened to that person when they were young that kind of epitomizes how they grew into that figure. In other words, say you have a biography or a figure in history who is a great explorer. Can you find in your research that sort of nugget of exploration or curiosity that's launched that person to become an explorer? And focus on their curiosity or their love of traveling into new areas. Something that's a young concept that can kind of create a biography in a young enough way that inspires the child to be interested in this person, but then they will read further about that person if they want more information. Studying picture book biographies right now, you've got this wonderful opportunity to do that. So go through these, hang on to these concepts, and think about the structure of a concept book will sort of organically get created around whatever concept you choose. So to break down plot versus story, because I know a lot of people sort of say, well, I have trouble with my plot, or what is plot? For my purposes, I like to think of plot as the character's physical journey through the story, and story as the character's emotional journey. And to break that down a little more, think about your plot is your action. The story is the character challenges and choices as a result of that action. So story becomes, how does the character kind of meet the challenge to reach their goal? That's in a most simple term. But with the emotions that come with that. So if your action is child needs to go to bed, doesn't want to go to bed, needs to figure out how to go to bed. It's sort of a banal example, but if that's your sort of basic humdrum plot, the story then is where the emotions take hold, where the interesting stuff happens, where maybe instead of just wanting a glass of water before they go to bed, maybe they need to, I don't know, talk to the mouse that's under the bed before they go to bed, because they know a mouse is under there, a good mouse, or maybe not. Maybe it's a bad mouse or a scary mouse, but nobody else knows the mouse is there. You know, it's sort of figuring, story is where your imagination can really take hold. So the plot is just your sort of basic action line that kind of runs up here. The story is a little more messy, and it has more movement, and it's sort of at the heart of the story and of the manuscript, I should say. A lot of plot and story will be illustrated in a picture book. And this is, again, the biggest challenge, I think, for picture book writers who are not illustrators, is to allow things to be left unsaid for the illustrator to then say them in pictures. This is a process. Most of the picture books I work on are overwritten, and it takes kind of a set of eyes like mine, for example, to say in the margin, you know what, you don't need to say this here, that will be shown in the illustrations. Trust that process. But it's a process that revision is going to be important to get you there. So I would advise you overwrite first, because you can always pare it down and pare away. So I mentioned before about leaving room for your reader. So I've created this sort of pie chart to remind you that as a child is experiencing a picture book, think about it as, for the 100% of the best experience, a third of it is the text, a third is the art, but a third of it is the reader themselves. There is kind of an academic that I won't get into in too much depth, but it's thinking about the reader response and how important that is in the experiencing of a book and of a story. Essentially what this means is, thinking about what the reader brings to the experience of reading the book. They bring emotions. They bring their own life experiences. They bring some knowledge of the world, a small world, but some knowledge. But they also bring their own interpretations to pictures and text based on who they are, based on their own family experiences, based on dynamics with friends, based on anything in their lives. Just as we bring our own experiences, and as adults, we bring our own biases and prejudices and experiences and emotions to the reading of a book, which is often why we like or not like a book. Because something about it doesn't resonate with us, or we get angry. But so think about this as little kids bring their own emotions. So why this is important is because we want to leave room for readers to have emotions, to have some interpretations, to have a moment in the story where they pause and can think about, I wonder what I would do in that situation. What if you're reading a story about a little girl and her father who love feeding the animals in the barn at night? So you have a story about this. But what if you need to leave room for the reader to think about, ooh, what would that be like if I was in the barn at night with my father? Or, for example, and this is where things get a little more complex, what if you have a reader, A, who's from the city, who has never been in a barn at night, let alone in the daytime? How is that reader going to respond? Or what if you have a reader who doesn't have a dad? How is that reader going to respond? You know, now, of course, you can't predict who all your readers are going to be, and you can't write for every single kid in the world, but you can leave some things unsaid for your reader to sort of fill in and put themselves in the character's shoes, because that's what readers do, particularly little kids. They want to be that character. So this happens in the pictures where there's room for reader response. This happens in the story. But the reader's feelings are what's going to connect them to your book. So the more feelings you allow them to have, whether it's sad or excited or interested, the more they're going to want to experience that book again. And that's a goal for all of us. As you think about the spread that I showed you, and I said that when you turn the page, that's like a cliffhanger, and you go into from one scene to the next, that page turn in a book is full of emotion. It can be, oh, what's going to happen next? Or it's going to be, oh no. Or it's going to be, uh-oh. There's something that a reader feels naturally before that page is turned. And that's a goal that we want to achieve. Again, this is something that comes through revision and rewriting, but studying picture books, reading picture books, and really saying to yourself, what is my response here? What would a child's response be to this spread, and to that spread, and to this spread? Understanding that can be really helpful. You may have heard of a phrase called mentor texts. This is basically an extension of reading picture books. But if you think about, I want to write a bedtime story, so then you want to immerse yourself really in lots of bedtime picture books to sort of get a sense of what's already out there in the market. How do they work, what don't. So if you can find a mentor text that kind of helps you study picture books about bedtime, those are really valuable to have. So we're kind of coming to a point where I want to just remind you of some things to think about. It's a lot for, picture books are 32 pages. They're short. They're deceptively simple and they are deceptively complex. But the key things to think about is thinking visually. Artists, illustrators, those of you who write and illustrate, you've got to jump on those writers who don't illustrate in terms of thinking visually. But writers, you too need to think visually, and that's why the 32-page layout is really helpful. So as you think about how your story is flowing, you can think about it page by page, spread by spread, what's going to be seen on each page. Is it interesting enough? Is it progressing forward? So thinking visually is really important in a picture book text. Think short. Word count. Again, there's no hard and fast rule to how many words picture book texts have to be, but I am here to tell you the fewer the better. Choose every word very, very carefully, very thoughtfully. Overwrite the first few drafts and then start paring away to find the best words, the juiciest words, the best words that you want to read aloud. You're allowed to think deeply when you think about picture book writing. 3 to 6 year olds, they may be young, they may not have huge life experiences yet, but they're not, what is the right word? They're deep, they're deeper than we realize. They're emotionally deep. They have a range of emotions. They have a range of feelings. So you can go deeply into emotions in picture books. You're allowed to do that. So don't feel you have to stay sort of on the surface. That's the term I was thinking of. If you look at picture books about death, about the death of a beloved pet, about the death of a grandmother, death of anybody, these can be quite deep. They can be simple, but they can be deep. And that's the sort of beautiful challenge and the beauty of picture books. Think subtle. There too, you don't want to hit people over the head with, take the same example, a book about death. There can be subtleties to the emotions that are expressed. I think one of the things I see a lot in picture book writing is phrases like, she was sad, or he was happy. So I'm here to challenge you to be more subtle in your expression of how the character is feeling. There are many, many ways, and this is a subject for a whole other webinar, of how to show and not tell emotions. But this is where subtlety comes in, where thinking about, instead of saying he was angry, an example I enjoy sort of visualizing is, can this kid kick something? Can this kid break something? Without you saying he's angry, that action alone will show us in a context that they're angry. So it's kind of thinking about, what is the emotion I want to show here? What do I want to express here? But then how can I be a little more subtle about that? As you think about the pacing, think about every page, every spread, every page turn. And look at those, if you're sort of stuck in pacing, or if you get any feedback that the pace feels too slow or the pace feels off on this manuscript, go back to those structures that we looked at and break it down into your pagination and think about, how is this paced out? Is this really working in a form that is going to keep compelling? That's where the sort of rule of 3 comes in handy. That can help you with the pace. Character has a challenge or problem. If they try 3 times to fix it and something develops in each time and then there's a resolution, that can keep your pace on track. Think fresh. Easy for me to say, I know, but there are picture books out there about everything already, I promise you, but they haven't been written by you yet. So think fresh. And this is where coming up with new ways to show emotion, new ways to get a child to bed, whatever it is, as fresh as you can is ideal. And finally, think like a child, like a young child. You really have to get back in that space of a child's point of view, a child's world experience. So what are your to-dos? What are your takeaways? Read, read, read lots and lots and lots of picture books. Read them to yourself quietly. Read them aloud. Read them aloud. If you can, go to Story Hour at the library. I've done this in my local library. There's Mrs. Katz Reads and Her Hats, and she goes in every Thursday and reads to kids. And sometimes I've sat in just to see how the kids respond to the books that she's reading. So read a lot of picture books, read them aloud. Read your manuscripts aloud over and over and over. Seeing them on the screen is a very different experience than hearing them aloud. If you can, have someone read your manuscripts aloud to you over and over. You have a different experience of your own work if you hear it read in somebody else's voice. So make picture book dummies, and our next slide will help you with that. Again, it's kind of a form that you can use of a structure to figure out, okay, I've got 32 pages, how do I do this? And please, please be patient, because you're going to be revising many, many times. I promise you. All authors do, whether they're Caldecott winning, Newbery winning, award-winning authors who have published many books, or whether you're a first-time author. Every author needs to revise many, many times. That is part of the process. And it's a great part of the process, because in revision comes a lot of your inspiration. So here is a typical 32-page picture book dummy, or what some people call a template or a layout. And again, it breaks down how a picture book works. Some artists call these thumbnails, and artists break out their picture books like this all the time. They may do dozens of layouts and thumbnails to figure out what's going to be on each page, what's going to be on each spread, where are my page turns coming. For those of you who have not worked with this before, please note that a spread is always the even number on the left-hand page. So 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm doing this, but I think I should do it this way for you. But use this layout. Now you'll see I have a note here in the bottom right corner. Some picture books are 40 pages. 32 is most typical. So for our purposes today, to keep it simple, to keep it direct, 32 pages is really what you can use to work with. I've listed just 4 resources here for you if you find you're someone who really likes to work with books. To get more information, the first one I recommend is Writing Picture Books by Anne Whitford Paul. It's a terrific, recently updated how-to. She's a very established, award-winning picture book author. There's writing exercises in this book, and it's really kind of the Bible for anyone who wants to be writing and working with picture books. Writing with Pictures by Yuri Shulevitz. Yuri was a brilliant illustrator artist. So the kind of focus of this book is from a more visual perspective, but writers have found this book to be wildly useful. Illustrating Children's Books by Salisbury. Again, he's an illustrator, but the book is geared to writers and illustrators. And then again, Illustrating Children's Picture Books. I do recommend for authors, even if you're not illustrators, to look at some of these books, because it will help you start to think visually about picture books. And so now Julia, I'm going to turn it over to you to help people understand what it is you're exactly looking for at Feeding Minds Press.
Sure. Just want to check. You can hear me, right, Emma?
Mm-hmm.
Hear me still? Okay, great.
Yes.
All right. I have myself on mute for the whole time. Okay. Great. Yes, I would love to tell you all a little bit about the kind of books, manuscripts that the Feeding Minds Press is going to be looking for. First, anyone can submit a manuscript. We have unsolicited manuscript submission form on our website. You can find it by going to feedingmindspress.com and clicking up in the right-hand corner. You'll see submissions. You can click that. So here are some of the things that we are looking for. First of all, we're looking for both fiction and nonfiction books. We've got a couple of nonfiction books in the works right now, so both of those are fine. And when it comes to story and plot, we do not want books where grandpa explains it all. And I know that's kind of a harsh way to put it, but we really want a story that focuses on the child as the character. We don't really want an adult talking down to a kid and just telling them everything. That's boring. Kids don't want that in real life. They don't want to read about it either. So make sure your story is about that child discovering things. And if they're discovering things about agriculture, food and farming, of course, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for stories that also highlight modern agricultural practices. We don't want things like milking a cow on a stool. All of that stuff, while you can milk a cow on a stool, it's just not how it's done right now. And so we're looking for ways to show off modern agriculture practices. Something I say a lot when I'm talking about Feeding Minds Press is we are looking for, we're not looking for old MacDonald has a farm. We are looking for new MacDonald flies a drone. So if you have an idea for new MacDonald flies a drone, send it my way. We are, looking for manuscripts like that.
Ooh, I love
and then, of course,
idea.
to focus. So we're also looking, of course, for topics that are of interest to agriculture, such as crops, livestock, machines, food, pollinators, bugs, nutrition, gardening. These are things that are right on the top of our list for topics that we're looking for. And it doesn't have to be specifically just a bunch of facts about any of these things. Again, it's about a child discovering some of these things as they go through a story. Having a story is very important. The next bullet is also incredibly important to us. While a lot of picture books do feature animals that talk, and they're wonderful stories, Feeding Minds Press will not be publishing books with anthropomorphic animals in it. A lot of times animals are our food, so we don't want them to be our friends in these books. We don't want to kind of confuse children that way. And then also, we don't want any unsafe situations for kids or adults, really. But specifically, we don't want a story where a kid steals a tractor. Don't do that. All of the books and images have to be of a safe nature. And then finally, magic and whimsy are okay in these books. Of course, we're looking for accurate books about agriculture, but magic and whimsy are fine as long as the food and agriculture part of the story remains accurate and realistic. So those are important things to consider as well. And we are looking for mostly picture books in that 500 to 800 word kind of category as well. So make sure you keep that in mind when you submit to us. So Emma, do you have anything to add to that? We have been getting some more questions as I've talked.
Okay.
I've written down some questions as well, so I will ask you those if you don't have anything specific else to add.
Okay. No, I think I'm just going to add, particularly for folks who know me and know my work, I've learned a lot working with Julia and with Feeding Minds Press because I am not an ag expert by any means. But it's been very interesting to work on manuscripts for Feeding Minds Press and then learn about new agricultural practices, why a kid milking a cow on a stool is kind of considered very old-fashioned now. And so it's an interesting opportunity for those of you picture book writers and illustrators who may be interested in submitting to a very active, vibrant, small press. So I guess, Julia, is there a kind of simple place for people who don't know about modern ag practices to go to find out about modern ag practices? Does that make sense? Like a
Sure.
website
So
or
I think one great thing to do would be to check out the American Farm Bureau Foundation for Agriculture has a recommended book list. So we've been recommending accurate ag books for 10 years. So some of them might be a little bit older, but if you go to agfoundation.org and you check out our recommended publications, you'll be able to see what kind of books that we like. So those are books that we've recommended that other publishers have put out in the past. So those kind of things could be a good place to start.
great.
And of course, if you have, particular questions about, what kind of agriculture you're thinking about, there are a lot of associations out there that you could find some really great facts on as well. For example, there's an American Beekeeping Association. You can go to websites like that to find more information out.
American Beekeeping, I love it. Great.
Yeah.
No, I'm happy to answer some questions if I can. So
Sure. I'm just going to start with the list. Thank you everyone who's been typing in your questions. So we got some questions as we were going along.
okay.
Someone wanted you to just clarify when you're talking about reading the story out loud, you're talking about the story being read to a child versus the child reading it themselves.
Is there a difference? I'm trying to understand. Read the question again, Julia. Maybe
They asked, can you clarify, is it for readers as in it's meant to be read aloud? I always thought it was meant to be read to a child. So I think that this person is asking more. Okay, you understand. Okay.
Okay. So yes, ultimately the audience for the picture book is the young child, and once the book is published, you'll be reading it aloud with children or to a child. Absolutely. What I'm talking about in terms of preparing you to write for children's picture books is to read books aloud just so you can hear them, because part of the purpose of picture books is for the language to be heard. So as you're studying picture books, read them aloud to hear them, to hear how they feel. And also as you're writing your manuscripts, read those manuscripts aloud. This is a part of the writing and revision process. Because ultimately, yes, the books will be read aloud with children, but they won't be read by you to a child. The author is no longer there to sort of say, that's not how that's pronounced, or that's not what I meant. So the more you can understand this concept of what hearing a manuscript aloud feels like, the better. So I hope that answers the question.
Excellent. Okay, so someone asked about nonfiction and if we're looking for narrative versus expository kind of writing. As far as Feeding Minds Press goes, submit your manuscript,
Yeah.
Let's take a look.
Yeah.
Someone else asked for a picture book, if you had a picture book example for a symmetrical paradigm, if you had an example for that style that you could think of.
Oh, you know what? That's a really good question. I don't offhand, and I'm sorry about that. If I had more time, we could sit here and actually go through some picture books together to see how they work in that symmetrical paradigm. But I'm actually going to make a note for myself to look at some picture books. There's a book that I edited some years ago called Bear Snores On. And it's in rhyme, but it has a very specific kind of story arc. And it does have kind of a first act, a second act, and a third act. So I think that would fit into that symmetrical paradigm. And it does come full circle at the end. So I think that's one that I would give as an example. Bear Snores On by Karma Wilson and Jane Chapman. And that book did launch a series of other books about the same characters, but there's a sense in those books of this kind of structure that we're talking about. It's a like I say, it's a very kind of rigid structure for picture books. So I caution that it's the kind of structure maybe to play with and not to sort of lock yourself into too hard. But for some authors, they really kind of like and respond well to that structure. That's why I bring it up.
Excellent. Someone asked about weird facts, writing about weird facts. There's a lot of weird facts in agriculture, a lot. Have you ever seen what a Brussels sprout plant looks like? Google that. That's weird. Check it out. Check it out.
I'm actually looking at a manuscript now about weird animal facts, and weird, like really crazy weird, and I love it. You know, so the
kids
weird
love weird.
Better.
So, yeah. Yep. We're looking for all kinds of weird things.
About
so
bugs,
go for
about plants, about animals. Yeah, it's interesting.
Weird. Someone asked, you know, I think they were talking about sticking to kind of one of your buckets. Like they specifically asked, what would a picture book be considered that had, you know, a conflict adventure, but was also teaching colors? So would it be a concept book? Would it be problem solving? You know, can we have these two kind of mashed together?
You can mash up these ideas together. We call them a mashup. Sometimes we call them a crossover book, where, you know, ideally, if you can kind of do a concept and an adventure and a goal challenge all in one, good on you. You know, it's hard to do well, but you absolutely can, and I think it's a great challenge to try to do that. Sometimes I've seen manuscripts that are kind of a straightforward story, but for whatever reason lend themselves to maybe adding a concept like counting to them. I'm thinking, for example, of, say, a book about gardening or going through the garden, and maybe instead of the child sort of discovering carrots and beans and lettuce, maybe you add a counting concept to that. So it's 1 head of lettuce, 2 carrots, 3 green beans. You know, it's that kind of mashing it up in a simple way that makes sense. But you absolutely can. And if you can, that's terrific. I think that is almost, it gives a publisher more hooks to kind of sell the book. And we didn't talk about marketing because that's not what this session is about. But publishers and editors are always looking for, what are the hooks? What will hook a reader? What will hook a buyer to buy this book? So if you can say it's not only kind of a gardening book, but it's also a concept book, then you've got 2 hooks to kind of work with. So that could be great. Could be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I saw a lot of people asking about illustrators. Right now, we are looking for manuscripts. If you happen to also be an excellent illustrator, we do offer the option for you to submit illustrations with the book. It is not a guarantee that we will choose those illustrations for the book. A lot of the times, authors and illustrators don't even get to talk to each other. Emma, do you want to talk to that at all?
Sure. I mean, in a typical sort of traditional publishing scenario, the publisher will hire the illustrator for the manuscript. So you writers, you will be submitting your manuscripts, and you trust that the publisher and editor and art director will find the right match for the illustrator. And often the author and illustrator never meet. They sort of work through the editor or through the publisher to create this wonderful sort of whole project. part of the reason for this is that historically, we haven't wanted the writer to feel impinged upon by the illustrator's vision, and we haven't wanted the illustrator to feel restricted or impinged upon by the writer's vision for the book, so that they each bring something unique and special to the whole, and then it's usually a wonderful marriage. In working with Julia on Feeding Minds Press, something that's been very fun for me and also for the authors and illustrators we've worked with is that we are a very collaborative group. And so we purposely introduce the author and the illustrator early on in the process. And, you know, we don't put them in a room to do the book together necessarily, but we keep a very open kind of dialogue among us to do the work together. And it's worked out very well. We can do that in a very small, controlled, safe environment. Because often the illustrator vision and the author vision don't mesh on something, and that's something that has to be sort of managed and sorted out. Yeah, as Julia said, if you are a writer and illustrator, then you know, you should be creating picture book dummies for all your picture books, whether it's black and white sketches at first and maybe some sample colors, you know, that's, as Julia said, and she's not alone in this, if for some reason the illustrations don't suit that imprint, but they love the text, they may ask you, can we separate these? Can we take your text but use a different illustrator? And that should be a very open conversation and dialogue where you can say yes or no. You know, you'll figure out what the most comfortable way to publish is. So I hope that helps.
Great. I'm going to do a couple rapid fire ones because we got some questions I can easily answer. Do we want manuscripts that are paginated, which means you put the page numbers on? We would like you to submit a version without page numbers and with page numbers if you feel like that's helpful. You don't have to break it out by pages yet, but when we go through the editing process, that's going to be happening again, so you can see those spreads. And it's probably helpful for you to do that as you were originally writing it, so you can imagine your text on spreads as well. Do we offer royalties or do we hire work for hire? Right now we've done both of those. So yes, we do offer royalties. Our response time on submissions, again, you can submit on feedingmindspress.com. Up at the top, you see the submission. A couple more people asked us how to do that. Our response time is typically about 6 months. Right now, we'll probably get a little bit faster as we put more titles out. Are we accepting rhyming books? Yes, but as Emma has said, it's kind of hard. They need to kind of be perfect in order to be published into books. Someone asked about American agriculture. While we would accept books about agriculture all over the world, it's going to be a lot easier for me to get past my editorial panel if it is about American agriculture, as the company is within the American Farm Bureau Foundation for Agriculture. So keep that in mind. Let's see. And I wrote some more down. Someone wanted to know, Emma, if you could give them a few more examples of emotional traits besides curiosity, maybe that young readers might have.
Emotional traits, gosh, everything. Sadness, anger, fear. Fears are huge. Curiosity, absolutely. Joy. You know, in thinking about kids, young kids, we can't think of them in this kind of protected, precious bubble. Let's just think about the 3 to 6 year olds right now all around the world who have been living through the last 6 weeks. You know, confusion, fear, curiosity are real, but also joy, comfort, warmth, doubt. You know, The range of emotions that we feel as adults, little kids feel those too, just at a simpler level. And I don't even know if simple is the right word. It's a less complex level. Little kids are very aware. Um, they don't always understand, though, what things mean or how things look. Um, so don't be afraid to include any sort of emotions in the story, as long as those emotions are appropriate to the story. But little kids, I mean, I think there is a reason to be publishing picture books that are hopeful. Um, that doesn't mean that the whole book has to be hopeful all the way through, but by the time it comes to the end, I think there's a reason to keep it hopeful at the end. Um, you know, picture books are used to entertain, but they're also used to soothe kids. They're used to help kids understand large concepts on a smaller level. So this gamut of emotions is open territory. Again, as long as the emotions are appropriate to the child, to your character, to the storyline itself. I hope that answers the question.
Awesome. Okay, two more quick questions. Someone asked about writing Illustrator description as they go, and I think that I'll let you answer that one, Emma.
Okay. Yeah, there is kind of an ongoing, pretty ferocious debate, I would say, about whether to include art notes or not in your manuscripts for picture books. I generally ask that you don't. I have seen plenty of manuscripts, though, that have art notes, and I usually delete them and write in the margin, not necessary. And here's the reason why. Now, in early drafts, you may need to write art notes for yourself. And I would encourage that, because it's very good practice for you writers to think visually. So why not write art notes for yourselves to help you kind of keep control of what's going on in the story visually as well as in your text. The art, though, should not necessarily literally duplicate what's in the text. And that's where illustrators are very important to the process, because illustrators often bring some unexpected things to the illustrations that are not necessarily in the text, but I digress. Art notes, I don't find them useful or helpful necessarily, because I know how to read picture book manuscripts. And this is something that writers of picture books need to recognize, is that when you're sending a picture book manuscript to an agent or to an editor or to a publisher, those of us who are reading your manuscripts, we know how to think visually. We automatically think about the spreads, the pages, the page turns as we're reading. It's kind of organic to our process of assessing a manuscript. So if something's confusing, we may need some assistance. But what I have found is that if you have an overall vision for example, this child who's in the barn at night, the author's vision, if it's spring, that I think needs to be said, perhaps. Though now I'm going to take that back. I was going to say if it's winter, you need to say so. If it's spring, you need to say so. But I'm going to backtrack on that, because something in the text could be the tip-off that it's winter or spring. Just like what the child is wearing will show us that it's cold out. So you may not even have to say the season. This is sort of me going through my process of assessing picture books. I do this process all the time. Do you have to say it, or is there a way to show it without saying it? So again, I think art notes are often a crutch that writers feel are necessary because the reader won't get it. They won't understand what the writer means. And I would urge you to, in the revision process, challenge yourself to remove the art notes little by little. You may end up keeping some in. Some publishers are really rigid about this in their submission guidelines. They absolutely do not want art notes. I think Feeding Minds Press is more, we're more open to that, but I would beg you not to fill your manuscript with art notes. We don't want to be dictated to as we're reading the manuscript. Again, reader response. Let us respond emotionally, and then we'll start seeing pictures in our heads as to what might be illustrated on the page. That's the exciting part of the process for us. So it's a process.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks for explaining that one. Someone asked if we will publish picture books with actual photos. That you know, every book is different. We will be looking at that manuscript, trying to figure out what would work best for that manuscript, if it's going to be photos or if it's going to be illustrations. So right now we are working on some books that use photos, kind of with illustrations as well. So,
I will jump in. You know, Julia, you and I have talked about this. Photos, I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but tend to be a more expensive production commitment than illustration. Yeah. And sometimes I know in the course of my publishing career, books with photos just tend to be more expensive to produce, which can be prohibitive. So that's just something we also think about too.
Yeah, there's lots of photo license laws and things like that that you have to think about when you're putting that book together. We do try to get our illustrators on farms or connected with farmers, things like that. So if there are illustrators that are interested out there, you don't have to know exactly what a specific kind of tractor looks like. We do help our illustrators with that kind of thing when we're working on our books. You know, we got a couple more questions coming in. I've gotten them written down, but I do want to just take a minute, Emma, and just ask you for a question from me. If you have some picture books right now that are some of your favorites, or some of your favorites just in life in general, ones that you always go back to.
Oh, this is a tough one. This is really tough. You know what? I mentioned Bear Snores On before. It is a favorite. It's kind of a darling. It was one of the very first picture books that I was able to acquire when I first started at Simon & Schuster. And to me, it's kind of a perfect picture book. It's a perfect rhyming picture book. Again, rhyme is tough. For me, that rhyme really works well. There's a surprise, there's a twist, there's a resolution. The illustrations are just gorgeous. And so that's sort of a book in a series that I hold up as a personal favorite. I have some art from it on the wall back there, which you probably can't see, but I do. You know, the picture books, Olivia, are great books. They're very subtle. Talk about subtle, and sort of bringing sort of adult type situations down into a level and a form that young readers can appreciate, but also the Olivia books are books that adults can appreciate. And that's an interesting sort of challenge to think about. But gosh, it's hard to name favorites because
Of course.
Yeah. What about, I'm going to turn it back on you because you have young kids. Are there any that you find have been really wildly successful when you read aloud with your kids?
Yeah, and you know what's funny, maybe my kids just have more of like a dark sense of humor, but I did kind of think about, especially when you were talking about how kids bring something to the book themselves.
Yeah.
The book, and I'm pretty sure this is the title. It's called I Want My Hat Back. Oh. I don't know if you've seen it. It's got a surprise ending, and it's a little bit dark what happens in the end of this book. But it's also kind of up to interpretation if the kid can kind of figure out what happens at the end of this book, because it is a little bit dark. You kind of question, did that really happen or not? So that's a very subtle and fun book, and they really like that one as well.
Yeah.
But when it comes to books about, you know, agriculture, the American Farm Bureau Foundation for Agriculture has a list of books that have won our Book of the Year title. And those are, most of those are picture books that we have a list of those on our website people can check out. And one of my favorites from that list is a book called Apple Orchard Riddle. And that book is probably a little bit longer. It's probably closer to more of 1,000 words. But it really does a great job of incorporating a lot of information about agriculture and a story with a real character in it. So I would encourage folks to check out Apple Orchard Riddle for an example of that.
Riddle. That would be a great book to study. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. So people are mentioning it is called I Want My Hat Back. It's really funny. You guys should check that one out. It's a little bit dark. But
well, that's an interesting
I don't know. Sometimes
book.
It can be surprising, you know?
Yeah, it was controversial, and a lot of adults didn't like it or didn't understand it. And then kids, to your point, brought their own experiences to it, figured it out at the end. You know, I think it's kind of brilliant for that, where, yeah, if you can sort of leave a story with an ending that gets the kids interested in what might happen next after the book ends, then you've got a really successful picture book on your hands. Though it can,
right.
To adults, they may think, oh, this isn't wrapped up nice and neatly. But kids are okay with that. If
Right.
you get a kid to trust you as the story goes along and trust the pictures, and if they feel they're in safe hands, then you can leave that story a little open-ended at the end, and kids will be right there with you. That's a really good example.
Right. Thanks. So we did get a couple more questions, and I do want to make sure that we answer those. So I'm going to write those down, folks, and we're going to just email you guys some answers. We don't want to miss you guys. And if there's anything specific that you guys think of later, you guys can send me an email. I'm going to send out information after this so everyone has a copy of the recording and has another chance to ask more questions so that you guys can feel like your questions are answered. Do you have anything you want to add, Emma?
No, I hope people found this helpful and useful. I know I'm sort of throwing a lot of information at you. There are a lot of things that I didn't talk about. You know, we could talk for hours about picture books. I hope your takeaway, though, is have fun with this process. Read a lot of other picture books. Read your own work aloud, and just know that the revision process will yield a lot of interesting results. And hopefully we'll see some wonderful work from all of you. That would be great. And as I say, I'm really glad to be here with all of you. I hope everybody stays well and healthy and as creative as possible in this time. Don't beat yourselves up if you're not feeling creative every minute of every day. Right now it's hard to sort of rustle up creativity and focus. I know that personally. I know it from all of the authors I work with, to just go easy and try to have fun with this.
Well, thank you. And I want to say a special thank you to our wonderful presenter, Emma Dryden. Thank you, Emma. We're getting a lot of people saying thank you in the chat too. Thank you for your wonderful expertise. Thank you for sharing that with us today.
Great.
So we really appreciate you. And thank you everyone who joined us today. We're going to be signing off soon. So we'll send you the rest of the information at a later time. Thank you for joining us. Submit your manuscripts, feedingmindpress.com. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.